Great Salt Lake Valley, Utah Territory, September 1847. When Brigham Young's advance party arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in July 1847, establishing what would become Salt Lake City, they found the valley largely uninhabited except for occasional Native American camps. The Mormon pioneers were the first significant European settlement in the region, which made the discovery 3 months later of an established homestead 20 miles south of the new settlement, both surprising and deeply troubling. The homestead belonged to a man who identified himself as Jeremiah Whitmore. He claims to have arrived in the valley 2 years earlier, in 1845, making him the first permanent European settler in the region by a considerable margin. He lived in a substantial stone house with 4 women he introduced as his wives: Sarah, age 28, Elizabeth, age 26, Margaret, age 24, and Catherine, age 22. All 4 claimed to have married Whitmore in ceremonies conducted by him, as he stated he was an ordained minister empowered to solemnize his own marriages. The Mormon settlers were initially accepting of this arrangement. Polygamy was being secretly practiced among church leadership at the time, though it wouldn't be publicly announced until 1852. A man with multiple wives wasn't scandalous to this particular community. What was scandalous was everything else about the Whitmore household. The 4 wives were eerily similar in appearance. All had dark hair, all had blue eyes, all stood approximately the same height. They moved in synchronized ways that observers found unsettling. They spoke in similar voices, often finishing each other's sentences. They wore identical clothing, and, most disturbingly, they seemed to have no individual personalities, no separate identities, no existence outside their role as Whitmore's wives. When questioned about their backgrounds, all 4 women gave nearly identical stories. They'd been traveling west with wagon trains. Their families had died or abandoned them. They'd encountered Whitmore, who'd offered them protection and marriage. They'd accepted. They had no previous history they were willing to discuss. They had no personal possessions from before their marriages. They existed only as Mrs. Whitmore, 4 identical versions of the same constructed identity. The Mormon settlers, despite their acceptance of plural marriage, found the Whitmore household deeply disturbing. Church leaders attempted to interview the wives separately, to understand their situations, and ensure they were there voluntarily. The interviews revealed something that would eventually cause church leadership to ban any contact with the Whitmore family, and classify the household as something that shouldn't be acknowledged or discussed. Before we continue with the story of Jeremiah Whitmore and his 4 mysterious wives, we need you to join this investigation. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. Because stories like this, where frontier isolation concealed something profoundly wrong, deserve to be told. Leave a comment telling us what you think. We want to know if you believe some people use wilderness and isolation to create worlds that violate every natural law of human relationships. What happened at the Whitmore homestead didn't begin in Utah Territory. It began in Independence, Missouri, in 1843, with a man who should never have been allowed near vulnerable women. Jeremiah Whitmore appears in historical records first in 1843, though his origins before this date remain completely unknown. He arrived in Independence, claiming to be a minister from Pennsylvania, though no church in Pennsylvania has any record of ordaining him. He was approximately 40 years old, a tall man with penetrating eyes and a voice that witnesses described as hypnotic, capable of holding listeners' attention with unusual intensity. Whitmore established himself quickly in Independence's transient community. He offered religious services to families preparing for westward migration. He performed marriages for couples who needed ceremonies conducted quickly. He provided counseling to women who'd lost family members or faced difficult circumstances. He developed a reputation as someone who helped desperate people, though several community members later reported feeling uncomfortable around him in ways they couldn't articulate. In May 1843, a young woman named Sarah Hutchins approached Whitmore seeking help. Sarah was 24 years old, traveling west with her family. Her parents and siblings had died from cholera during the journey. She was alone, frightened, with no resources and no plan. Whitmore offered her shelter, protection, and eventually marriage. She accepted gratefully, seeing no other options available. The marriage occurred in June 1843. Whitmore conducted the ceremony himself, claiming his ministerial authority made this legally and religiously valid. No witnesses attended. No records were filed. The marriage existed only in Whitmore's and Sarah's understanding of their relationship. Over the following months, witnesses in Independence reported changes in Sarah Hutchins. She'd been a vibrant, independent young woman before marriage. After marriage, she became quiet, deferential, almost invisible. She spoke rarely. When she did speak, she repeated phrases Whitmore used, as if she'd lost her own vocabulary. She wore only dresses Whitmore selected. She went nowhere without his permission. She seemed to have surrendered all autonomy, becoming an extension of Whitmore rather than a separate person. In October 1843, a second young woman appeared at Whitmore's residence. Elizabeth Porter, age 22. Another orphan from a failed westward migration. She'd encountered Whitmore while seeking help in Independence. He'd offered her the same arrangement he'd offered Sarah: protection, shelter, and marriage. Elizabeth accepted. The second marriage raised concerns among Independence residents. Missouri law permitted only monogamous marriage. Whitmore explained that his first marriage had been spiritual rather than legal, that he was legally free to marry Elizabeth while maintaining his spiritual bond with Sarah. The explanation satisfied no one, but frontier law enforcement was minimal. As long as no one filed complaints, authorities wouldn't intervene. Neither Sarah nor Elizabeth complained. By December 1843, both women exhibited the same characteristics: quiet, deferential, moving in synchronized ways, dressing identically, speaking in similar patterns, existing as versions of the same constructed identity rather than as individuals. In February 1844, a third young woman joined the household. Margaret Thompson, age 20. Another orphan. Another desperate woman with no options. Another marriage conducted by Whitmore himself, with no witnesses and no legal documentation. The pattern was becoming clear to observers. Whitmore was targeting vulnerable women, offering them shelter and protection, then conducting marriage ceremonies that gave him complete control over them. The women seemed to surrender their individual identities, becoming interchangeable units in Whitmore's household. But no one intervened. Frontier culture valued privacy. Relationships between men and women were considered private matters, and the women, when questioned, insisted they were content. In June 1844, a fourth woman arrived, Catherine Mills, age 18, the youngest of what would become Whitmore's 4 wives. By this point, Independence residents were openly disturbed by the Whitmore household. 4 women, all similar in appearance, all exhibiting identical mannerisms, all completely subordinate to a man who claimed religious authority to justify his arrangements. Several community leaders attempted to intervene. A minister named Reverend Samuel Parker visited the Whitmore residence to counsel the women about the impropriety of their living situation. The 4 wives, speaking in unison as they increasingly did, insisted they were married legally and spiritually to Whitmore, that their arrangement was blessed by God, that they had no desire to change their circumstances. Parker left disturbed, but legally powerless to do anything. A county sheriff named Thomas Bradley investigated whether Whitmore was committing bigamy or holding the women against their will. The women insisted they were there voluntarily. Missouri law regarding polygamy was ambiguous enough that prosecuting Whitmore would be difficult without willing testimony from the wives. Bradley couldn't proceed with criminal charges. In August 1844, the Whitmore household disappeared from Independence. They departed at night, without informing neighbors or settling debts. They took everything they owned, leaving an empty residence, and no indication of where they'd gone. Rumors suggested they'd headed west, perhaps to Oregon or California, perhaps to somewhere even more remote, where Whitmore's arrangements wouldn't attract attention. The household vanished for 3 years. During that time, no confirmed sightings occurred. The 5 people simply ceased to exist in any documented way. Then, in July 1847, Mormon settlers arriving in the Salt Lake Valley discovered them already established, claiming to have been there for 2 years, living in a substantial stone house that suggested permanent settlement rather than temporary refuge. Church elder Heber Kimball visited the Whitmore homestead in August 1847. His journal, preserved in LDS Church archives, documents his observations. I encountered a household unlike any I have witnessed. A man with 4 wives, all of whom appear as if stamped from the same mold. They speak as one voice. They move as if choreographed. They have no individual will that I could discern. Brother Whitmore claims religious authority for his arrangements, but his authority comes from no church I recognize. The wives claim contentment, but their contentment seems not of healthy minds making free choices, but of people who have surrendered the capacity for choice entirely. Kimball attempted to interview the wives separately. Whitmore initially refused to allow it, claiming such interviews would violate his husband's rights and the wives' privacy. Kimball insisted, invoking his position as church elder. Whitmore reluctantly agreed, on condition that interviews be conducted at the homestead, where he could observe from a distance. Kimball interviewed each wife separately, over the course of a day. His journal records disturbing findings. Each woman told an identical story of meeting Whitmore during difficult circumstances, accepting his offer of marriage, and finding peace in their current arrangement. But the stories were too identical. Not just similar in content, but identical in phrasing, as if all four had memorized the same script and were reciting it word for word. When Kimball asked about their lives before meeting Whitmore, all four became vague and confused. They couldn't provide specific details about their families, their childhood homes, or their previous experiences. They seemed to have no personal history before their marriages, as if they'd been created at the moment they became Mrs. Whitmore, rather than having existed as separate people before that transformation. Most disturbing, when Kimball asked what they would do if Whitmore died, all four gave the same response. We would cease to exist. We have no purpose outside our marriage. We are nothing except his wives. This wasn't spoken with sadness or fear. It was stated as simple fact, as if they'd accepted complete erasure of individual identity as natural and proper. Kimball reported his findings to Brigham Young. Young's response was documented in church records. The Whitmore household represents something I cannot condone and cannot prevent. The man claims no affiliation with our church. The wives claim to be there voluntarily. We have no legal authority in this territory yet to intervene in domestic arrangements. But I instruct all members to avoid contact with that household. Something unnatural occurs there. Something that violates the spirit, if not the letter of how plural marriage should operate. We practice plurality to build families and raise righteous children. Whitmore practices something else, something that destroys rather than builds individual souls. The Mormon settlement grew rapidly through late 1847 and into 1848. The Whitmore household remained isolated, 20 miles south, having minimal contact with the growing community. Occasionally, settlers would see Whitmore at trading posts, purchasing supplies. He was always alone during these visits. The wives never appeared in public. Neighbors began reporting strange observations about the Whitmore homestead. Lights would burn all night in one of the windows. Sounds would emerge from the house, singing or chanting in multiple voices harmonized unnaturally. The four wives would sometimes be seen working in the garden, moving in perfect synchronization, planting or harvesting with movements so coordinated they seemed choreographed. Most disturbing, neighbors reported seeing the wives standing in a row outside the house during certain nights, facing east, completely motionless for hours at a time. They stood like statues, not moving, barely seeming to breathe, engaged in some activity or ritual that observers couldn't understand. In March 1848, a Mormon family named Henderson built a home within 3 miles of the Whitmore property. They attempted to be neighborly, visiting to introduce themselves. Whitmore received them cordially, but didn't allow them to enter the house or meet the wives. He explained that his wives were unwell and couldn't receive visitors. Henderson noted in his journal that he heard voices from inside the house speaking in unison, all saying the same words simultaneously, though he couldn't distinguish the words' content. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the Whitmore household's mystery reaches its darkest phase. If this story is affecting you, share this video with someone who appreciates frontier mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened when isolation allowed something unnatural to take root. because what occurred in the spring of 1848 would finally force the Mormon community to confront the Whitmore household directly. In April 1848, one of Whitmore's wives appeared in Salt Lake City, alone. She walked into the settlement in obvious distress, approaching the first person she saw and saying simply, "Help me. My name is Sarah. I need help." The woman was Sarah Whitmore, or Sarah Hutchins as she'd been before marriage. She was the first of Whitmore's wives, married to him for nearly 5 years. Her appearance in the settlement alone was unprecedented. She'd never been seen without Whitmore's supervision before. Church members immediately provided Sarah with shelter and called for church leaders. Heber Kimball interviewed her extensively over the following 3 days. His journal documents what Sarah revealed. Testimony so disturbing that church leadership debated whether to document it officially or suppress it entirely. Sarah claimed that Whitmore was not who he appeared to be. She said he was not a minister, had never been ordained, and practiced no recognizable form of Christianity. She said he'd been systematically destroying the identities of his 4 wives through techniques she couldn't fully explain, but that involved repetition, isolation, sleep deprivation, and something she called soul binding. According to Sarah, Whitmore believed he could merge multiple consciousnesses into a single entity that he controlled. He saw his wives not as separate people, but as extensions of himself, as fragments of his own consciousness operating in separate bodies. He'd been working for 5 years to complete this merger, using methods that Sarah described as combining religious ritual with something darker, something she hesitated to call magic, but couldn't otherwise name. Sarah said the process had nearly worked. She and the other 3 wives had progressively lost their individual identities, their personal memories, their capacity for independent thought. They'd been becoming components of a collective consciousness dominated by Whitmore's will. She described feeling her sense of self eroding, being replaced by thoughts and impulses that originated from Whitmore rather than from her own mind. She said she'd broken free through an act of extraordinary will during a moment when Whitmore had been distracted. She'd run from the homestead and walked 20 miles to the settlement, fighting the entire way against compulsion to return. Even now, separated from Whitmore, she felt him pulling at her consciousness, trying to draw her back into the collective he was creating. Kimball asked Sarah about the other 3 wives. Sarah began to cry, saying she didn't know if they could be saved. They were further along in the process than she was. Elizabeth, Margaret, and Catherine might be too deeply merged with Whitmore's consciousness to be separated. They might have surrendered so much of themselves that no individual identity remained to rescue. Church leadership debated what to do. They had no legal authority in the territory yet. They couldn't simply arrest Whitmore or forcibly remove the other wives. They could only offer Sarah protection and hope that her testimony would somehow lead to a solution. The solution came from an unexpected source. On April 19th, 1848, a massive fire consumed the Whitmore homestead. The blaze was visible from Salt Lake City, 20 miles away, burning so intensely that the stone house was reduced to rubble. When church members reached the property the next day, they found the house completely destroyed. Inside the ruins, they found 4 bodies. Jeremiah Whitmore and his 3 remaining wives, had burned to death. The bodies were so badly damaged that identification was difficult, but personal effects confirmed who they were. All 4 had died in the same room, positioned in a circle, around what appeared to have been an altar or ceremonial platform at the room's center. The fire's cause was never determined. It might have been accidental, a knocked-over lamp or stove malfunction. It might have been deliberate, Whitmore choosing destruction over allowing his collective to be disrupted. It might have been something else entirely. The remains provided no clear answers. Sarah Hutchins, when informed of the fire and deaths, showed a complex reaction. She expressed relief that she was free, sadness that the other wives hadn't escaped, and disturbing certainty that Whitmore had caused the fire deliberately. She said he would have preferred death to failure, that completing the merger of 4 consciousness into one had been his entire purpose, and that when he realized the merger was failing, because Sarah had escaped, he'd chosen to destroy everything, rather than accept incomplete success. Sarah attempted to rebuild her life in the Salt Lake settlement. She took employment as a seamstress. She attended church services. She tried to reintegrate into normal society, but she struggled constantly. She told church members that she still felt Whitmore's presence, still heard his voice in her mind, still experienced the pull of the collective consciousness he'd been creating. She said escaping physically hadn't meant escaping completely, that part of her remained bound to whatever Whitmore had created. In June 1848, Sarah disappeared. She left her residence at night, leaving behind her few possessions and a brief note that read, "I cannot fight it anymore. He is still calling. I have to return. Forgive me." Extensive searches found no trace of her. She was never seen again. Church members who'd known Sarah theorized that she'd returned to the burned homestead, perhaps believing some remnant of the collective still existed there. When searchers examined the ruins again, they found no evidence of Sarah's presence. No body. No indication anyone had visited the site recently. Sarah had simply vanished, drawn back to whatever had been created in that house, even after its physical destruction. The Whitmore case disturbed Mormon leadership profoundly. Brigham Young ordered that the homestead ruins be covered with earth and the site be marked as cursed ground, where no one should build or settle. Church members were instructed never to discuss the Whitmore household publicly, to treat it as something that hadn't occurred, to erase it from community memory as thoroughly as possible. The suppression was remarkably effective. The Whitmore case appears in few historical records. Kimball's journal entries were classified as sensitive material and weren't made available to researchers until 1963. Church meeting minutes from 1848 that referenced the case were edited before being officially recorded, removing detailed discussion of what had occurred. The site of the homestead was eventually lost, its exact location forgotten as the area developed and changed over decades. In 1932, a researcher named Dr. Robert Michaels was studying early Utah Territory history when he discovered references to the Whitmore case in fragmentary records. He attempted to research it thoroughly, interviewing descendants of church members who'd been present in 1847 and 48, examining what few documents he could access, and visiting the general area where the homestead had been located. Michaels published his findings in 1934 in a historical journal. His article, titled "The Whitmore Household: Polygamy or Something Darker," proposed that Whitmore had been attempting some form of psychological control over his wives, using techniques that combined religious manipulation with systematic destruction of individual identity. Michaels theorized that Whitmore believed he could create a form of shared consciousness, where multiple people's minds merged under his control. The article attracted minimal attention. Most historians dismissed it as sensationalized speculation. Mormon church leadership objected to the publication, arguing it presented polygamy in an inappropriately sinister light. The journal that published the article was pressured to print a retraction. Michaels's academic reputation suffered. He published no further research on the topic. In 1976, Michaels's research notes were donated to the University of Utah archives after his death. A graduate student named Jennifer Walsh discovered them and attempted to follow up on the Whitmore case. She found that accessing relevant church records was nearly impossible. Documents Michaels had referenced in his notes were now classified or restricted. Church archivists told Walsh that the Whitmore case was considered too sensitive for general research access, that it touched on issues of early polygamy practice that the church preferred not to publicize. Walsh published a brief article about the difficulty of researching the Whitmore case, arguing that suppression of historical information served no one's interests. Her article appeared in a small historical society newsletter and was largely ignored by mainstream academia. The Whitmore case remains one of the most poorly documented frontier mysteries, not because documentation doesn't exist, but because it's been systematically restricted. Church archives contain extensive records of the case, including Kimball's journals, meeting minutes discussing what to do about Whitmore, and testimony from Sarah Hutchins. But these records remain classified, available only to church historians conducting officially sanctioned research. Modern researchers who've studied the fragmented, available information about the Whitmore case have proposed various explanations. Some suggest Whitmore was an early cult leader who used isolation and psychological manipulation to control his wives. This explanation accounts for the wives' loss of individual identity and their synchronized behavior. Others suggest Whitmore might have been experimenting with hypnosis or other consciousness-altering techniques. In the 1840s, understanding of hypnosis was primitive, but various practitioners claimed they could induce states where subjects' behavior could be programmed or controlled. Whitmore might have been attempting to use such techniques to create the collective consciousness Sarah described. Still others have proposed that the case has been misunderstood, that the wives' synchronized behavior and shared identity were voluntary, that they'd chosen to subordinate their individuality to their husband's authority in ways that disturbed observers but weren't necessarily harmful. This explanation struggles to account for Sarah's desperate escape and her testimony about Whitmore's methods. The most disturbing explanation is that the case has been accurately described in available sources, that Whitmore was attempting something beyond simple psychological manipulation or hypnosis, that he believed he could literally merge multiple consciousnesses into a single entity, and that he was succeeding, at least partially, in this attempt. This explanation requires accepting that consciousness operates according to principles mainstream science doesn't acknowledge, that individual identity is more malleable than we believe, that multiple minds might be merged through techniques we don't understand. Whatever the truth of the Whitmore case, it represents frontier isolation allowing something profoundly wrong to develop unchecked. Whether Whitmore was a manipulative cult leader, an experimental hypnotist, or something stranger, he used wilderness and distance to create a household where 4 women lost their individual identities and became extensions of his will. The case raises disturbing questions about how isolation enables control, how vulnerable people can be systematically destroyed by those who offer them protection, and how complete erasure of individual identity might be possible through methods we don't fully understand or acknowledge. The Mormon community in 1847 and 48 recognized that something unnatural was occurring at the Whitmore homestead. They documented it, attempted to intervene, and ultimately witnessed its destruction. Then, they chose to suppress rather than preserve this knowledge, treating the case as something that shouldn't be remembered or studied. That suppression has been remarkably successful. Most people studying early Utah Territory history are unaware the Whitmore case exists. It appears in no popular histories. It's discussed in no mainstream academic works. It remains hidden in restricted archives, accessible only to researchers willing to fight institutional resistance to preserve knowledge that powerful organizations prefer remain forgotten. What do you think happened at the Whitmore homestead? Was Jeremiah Whitmore simply a manipulative predator who used psychological techniques to control vulnerable women? Or was he attempting something darker, trying to merge multiple consciousnesses through methods we don't understand? And why has this case been so thoroughly suppressed when other frontier mysteries are openly researched and discussed? Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who questions why certain historical cases remain deliberately obscured. The stories that institutions suppress are often the ones most important to examine. At Liturgy of Fear, we believe in investigating forbidden history honestly, acknowledging when powerful organizations choose concealment over truth, and preserving stories that were meant to be forgotten. See you in the next video.